All right. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Larry Kelly Mahaffey. I'm the representative from South Central Yearly Meeting to the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is the secular branch of Friends that lobbies Congress for national priorities. And we are going to review the current priorities of FCNL to see how they can be augmented or eliminated or added to or otherwise changed. There are 88 of these priorities, and you would think, oh, how can FCNL attend to all those priorities? But they have 20 lobbyists on staff, so that's only about 4 or 5 priorities per lobbyist. So I suppose they get around to it sometime during the year. But why don't we start with some silence? Thank you, friends. There are 4 sections to the priorities. And the first one, part 1, is we seek a world free of war and the threat of war. And as John Willman says, may we look upon our treasures and the furniture of our houses and our garments and try whether the seeds of war have any nourishment in these our possessions. And I think he was particularly interested in that time in cotton garments made by slaves, but it applies to still to today. So section 1 of part 1, building the framework of peace. FCNL supports efforts to integrate and strengthen peace-building efforts throughout the United States government. By the way, there is a link to the full set of priorities here, and I've put that link in the chat in case you want to look at the entire document. Number 2 of section 1, FCNL supports the United Nations. Now, friends, speak up if you are not easy or have some other concerns for section 1 or the rest of the sections. Section 2, reducing militarization and armaments. More weapons do not provide more security. Military spending displaces needed spending on human needs. I've left out FCNL as the subject of many of these for the sake of brevity. So FCNL opposes the militarization of foreign and domestic policy, opposition to conscription, and I'm going to have to read from the document itself because you guys are covering it up. Opposition opposes the militarization of foreign and domestic policy, opposition to conscription and social and selective service registration, and support for accommodation for conscientious objection, eliminate nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, opposes drones, cyber attacks, autonomous systems. Autonomous systems is new this year. Before it was just drone, cyber attacks, space weapons, and other new technologies has been added to inflict harm. And this is in anticipation of so-called robot warriors. You know, we've all seen these Boston Dynamic robots prancing about the countryside. Apparently the Pentagon is in the process of developing them as soldiers. So we are now opposing those. Move towards comprehensive disarmament. Section 3, preventing and resolving violent conflicts. Seek federal policies that avoid violence and embrace peaceful forms of resolving conflict. Reject preventative and preemptive first strikes. No attempt to overthrow other governments. Public accounting of all the costs of war. And that includes, I assume, the trauma in soldiers. 3, support nonviolent methods of conflict resolution. The U.S. should join the International Criminal Court. We are not now a part of that court, and the International Court of Justice. The authority of Congress to declare and initiate war and acts of war should be reestablished. This is something that the advocacy groups are constantly advocating with representatives, because as you probably know, war is often established merely through executive action. The U.S. should invest greater resources in developing capacity to prevent the outbreak of war, restore civil order, protect civilians, prevent exploitation, and ensure access to relief supplies and basic services. FCNL supports constructive, nonviolent responses consistent with Quaker values and testimonies to protect vulnerable populations from genocide, war crimes, etc. Sanctions can be constructive tools for negotiations, so we are not opposed to all forms of punitive measures. Precautions must be taken to minimize impacts on the daily lives of civilians, which I notice the current administration is attempting to follow. Section 4, building mutual understanding and trust. Understanding and trust are to be engendered with educational, commercial, scientific, and cultural exchanges. Support civilian programs that promote peace through personal experience with national and international humanitarian organizations. Call for solutions to the causes of hunger, deprivation, and conflict, with increasing attention to the damaging effects of climate change. Support eliminating slavery, trafficking in persons, the use of child soldiers, and the exploitation of child labor. Women should be fully included and represented at all levels of government. Support programs that address the physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual needs of veterans and active duty military personnel and their families. That concludes part 1. And if you are like me, it's quite overwhelming, the extent of all these priorities, and particularly when you read the full document, the detail in which they go into it. But I think what we should be doing is looking at the edges, looking at what's not being said, and perhaps sending that as priorities to FCNL. So it's a bit like when you're in Rome, and you see this very old building that's 1,000 years old, but in bas relief on the side of that building, you see the impression of a building that was 2,000 years old and has since been dismantled. We want to look for the bas relief in these statements to see what might be missing.
Larry?
Yes, sir.
If I may interject. Under Section 4, building mutual understanding and trust,
yeah.
These seem to be aimed at the international scene primarily. I would be interested to add a 5th element there about generating processes for enabling people in our country to begin to dissolve the gulf between partisanship and combative positions. I'd have to work on the wording, but I would like to support things like Braver Angels and communications, no labels, and other organizations that are designed to help us talk to each other across the divides that currently exist.
Okay, what I've written down is generate processes in our country, perhaps underlining that, to dissolve divisions within us. How's that?
To enable communication across the divides that exist within our country. That could be all sorts of different divides, racial or political or gender or whatever, but yeah, to support processes, I would say, because the processes are there. It's to actively support their use.
Okay, yeah, they use the word support quite a bit. Okay, support processes in our country to enable communication across divides.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, moving on to section 3. I'm sorry, part 2. Part 2, we seek a society with equity and justice for all. And the preamble is, we call for the right relationships among people and between individuals and God. Section 1, governmental institutions. Part 1, electoral process, shift emphasis in political campaigns from image making to understanding of perspectives on the issues and candidate qualifications. Open access to public office and electoral processes, curb the influence of money, safeguard the integrity of the voting process without raising unnecessary barriers, full participation by disenfranchised people, protect voting from foreign and domestic interference, nonpartisan redistricting. The Electoral College has come to distort democratic expression. So there you have the kitchen sink in terms of the electoral process. Publicly traded companies should be required to disclose their political contributions and lobbying. Reverse the impact of Citizens United. U.S. districts and territories. Citizens of non-state territories are entitled to the same rights as all other citizens. Government accountability and transparency. Create a climate, create a climate of truth-telling, good faith, and civil discourse. Government officials should abide by the Constitution, national and international law, and treaties. Checks and balances should be strengthened. There should be timely action on substantive issues in the legislative process. Strong protections for whistleblowers, journalists, and confidential sources. Timely and free access to accurate information. Candidates subject to Senate confirmation should be required to disclose federal and state tax returns. Independent media. Honor the independence of the press. Promote diversity of media ownership. Protect privacy. Accountability for inflammatory speech and false assertions of fact. Criminal justice. Redemption rather than retribution. Recognize the complex and pervasive causes of crime, often rooted in injustice. A system not based on race, gender, or immigration status. A system that treats juveniles as children. 10. Well-trained law enforcement is necessary to protect community safety. Support law enforcement emphasizing de-escalation techniques. A system that embraces restorative justice, reduces incarceration, and returns rehabilitated offenders to society with full rights and obligation. Incarceration of violent and destructive non-violent crime. I think that means less emphasis on incarceration for non-violent and non-destructive crime. Equitable and prompt adjudication. Adequate representation into detention based on ability to pay fines, fees, and bail. Treat substance abuse as a health issue. Detention facilities must provide humane conditions and basic rights. Against solitary confinement, profit making has no place in criminal justice or immigration systems. Abolition of the death penalty. Section 2, civil liberties and civil rights. Seek a society free from discrimination, separation of church and state, equal treatment of all people by the state. Surveillance programs must be limited. Expect our government to uphold rights in the Constitution, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Convention, international law and human rights. Urge the U.S. to ratify and participate in international treaties, oppose torture and indefinite detention, protect the right to boycott and divest. Section 3, communities free of violence. Advocate policies that encourage community mediation and conflict resolution. Support reduction of gun violence through regulation, universal background checks, bans on military-style weapons, and public health-oriented research and education. Section 4, repairing historical and ongoing oppression. Seek to eliminate institutional racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination. You'll notice there is some redundancy in all this. Society free of racism. Seek reconciliation and remediation. Examine our own unrecognized racism. Government should recognize our history of racism and establish policies to overcome it. Relationships with Native Americans. Conform to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Treaties and trust agreements must be honored. Respect tribal lands. Tribal police and courts should have authority over all criminal activity on reservation lands, which they don't now. Sexism, no harassment or violence on the basis of sex or gender identity. Section 5, immigration and refugees. Immigration and refugees should be allowed to stay in this country with their families while awaiting status decision or removal, and to apply for permanent status and eventual citizenship. Do this without undercutting workers already in the United States. Labor laws and health standards should be enforced. Dreamers should be provided with an expeditious path to citizenship. Support openness to refugees displaced by climate change, severe economic conditions, victims of violence and human trafficking, people vulnerable due to U.S. political or military interventions. Immigration is a civil issue, not a criminal one. That is, immigrants to this country are not illegal. Utilize alternatives to detention. Uphold the rights of detainees. Immigration law should be enforced by federal authorities, not by local enforcement. Oppose the militarization of our borders. And that brings us to part 3. We seek a community where every person's potential may be fulfilled. And the preamble is, each person has the right to basic necessities in a safe and sustainable environment. Equal opportunity to fulfill potentials and contribute to communities. Section 1, fostering economic justice. Eliminate poverty through policies that expand opportunities for all people. Reduce economic disparities and address the structural impediments to fair employment opportunities. Seek policies to ensure corporate responsibility, accountable boards of directors, and balanced emphasis on long-term investments and profits. Support cooperative enterprises. Federal government should strengthen and enforce antitrust, fraud, and securities oversight laws. Now, I'm going through these rapidly because there are 88 of them and we only have 50 minutes, but please interrupt me whenever you have something to contribute. Strive to create an economic system that is equitable and preserves and enhances resources for future generations. Replace GDP with economic indicators that measure health, longevity, education, quality of life, and income inequality. Domestic economic life. Resources should be refocused from military spending to human needs and environmental stewardship. Corporations must pay their fair share of taxes. Federal policy should oppose compensation that is not transparent and that hurts shareholders and the public. In general, ongoing federal programs should be paid for with current revenue. Government borrowing can be appropriate for countering economic recessions and long-term investments. And I think that's a wise policy, but we have not always followed that. Recognize the roles of both the government and the private sector in creating jobs. Guarantee all workers the right to organize unions and bargain collectively. Global economic interdependence. U.S. policy should not adversely affect the right sharing of world resources. Implement trade policies that promote sustainable development, maintain and strengthen existing regulatory standards, and are mindful of the impact of trade instruments on workers, consumers, and vulnerable populations. Provide for transparent and democratic participation by the full range of parties affected. Section 2, supporting people and building viable economies. National commitment to help states and local communities meet the needs of each person. Education. Educational systems must prepare all individuals to be innovative, creative, adaptable, collaborative, and analytical. So we have a lot of work to do there. Encourage the development and expansion of high-quality educational and vocational programs without burdensome debt. Support programs that promote civic engagement, peace, conflict resolution, and global awareness. Oppose military recruitment in schools and military training of minors. Food and water. Agricultural policies must support adequate supplies of healthy and diverse foods. Speaking of which, I'm told that only 1% of government subsidies for food are allocated to fruit and vegetables. All the rest goes to meat, fish, and such. And I would like to ask that FCNL emphasize more government subsidies for fruit and vegetables. How does that sit with us?
Certainly fits with the guidelines that the government is putting out about plant-based diets and so forth.
Well, in that case, 1% is not enough. Okay, housing. Oppose housing discrimination. Advocate for housing that is affordable, energy efficient, and healthy. And we want diverse neighborhoods. We're not opposing diverse neighborhoods. We're advocating for diverse neighborhoods. Healthcare. Universal access to healthcare is a right. And this is an interesting one that always puzzles a number of people. Members of FCNL are not in unity on abortion issues. The abortion debate should not paralyze action on other legislation. This is because a number of Quaker churches are opposed to abortion. And FCNL is the umbrella organization, the umbrella lobbying organization for Quaker churches as well as Quaker meetings. Healthy families. Children have a right to adequate food, housing, health care, and an environment free from violence, poverty, incarceration, and other health hazards. Pursue expansion of high quality, affordable, and safe childcare. Programs to prevent all forms of abuse. Medicare, Social Security, pension and retirement, and other programs that provide older people with access to affordable housing, healthcare, and other vital services should be maintained. along with programs that protect older people from neglect, abuse, exploitation, and age-based discrimination. Programs that support family members and other caregivers of older people should be emphasized. Transportation. Support policies that address the specific transportation needs of all U.S. communities. Communication. Support the development and maintenance of communication infrastructure that is readily accessible to all. Expand the capacities of digital media users in rural, low-income, and other underserved communities. Which brings us to part 4, the last part. We seek an earth restored. There is that of God in all creation. It would go a long way to caution and direct people in their use of the world that they were better studied and knowing the creation of it. William Penn said that. Only when we see that we are a part of the totality of the planet, not a superior part with special privileges, can we work effectively to bring about an earth restored to wholeness. Elizabeth Watson. Commit ourselves to being wise and responsible stewards of the earth. Section 1, Global Climate Change and Energy Policy. 1, responsible use and the right sharing of the world's resources. Current land, energy, and military policies are inextricably linked to climate change. Future policies should meet global humanitarian and environmental needs and must favor sustainability. Develop policies to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. Pricing and policy decisions for energy should reflect their true economic and environmental and social costs. That means not just the price that's on these things, but the secondary effects they have on the environment and human beings. Research sustainable energy technologies. Moratorium on the construction of nuclear fission power plants. Section 2, caring for the earth. Meet the needs of present and future generations without doing violence to the rest of creation. End the degradation of Earth's environment. Urge the U.S. government to protect and restore our environment. Acknowledge that the biosphere is finite and urge governments to implement policies that recognize this. Pollution prevention over pollution capture. Fair and equitable geographic distribution of waste facilities. Right now, a number of waste facilities are situated in neighborhoods of poverty and color, people of color. Analytical methods that make explicit the environmental impact of manufacturing and purchasing decisions. Adequate funding for environmental protection. A single standard of environmental laws and regulation for all. Sound agricultural base to ensure the availability of safe and affordable food and forest products. Prohibit brutal and inhumane treatments of animals in food production and testing. Evaluation, regulation, monitoring, and product labeling of foods, synthetic chemicals, and GMOs.
Larry?
Yes, sir.
One thought on this section is that I don't see any indication of support for programs which would minimize the carbon produced pollution or CO2 production directly, like market-based carbon tax or other methods like that to provide a mechanism for reducing CO2. I don't know how to word it, but that might be more.
And it was, you said support for what now? Policies?
For methods and policies which would reduce the generation of CO2 levels in our atmosphere.
I'm going to call that carbon production. Yeah.
Yeah.
Policies and methods. Let's see. Yeah, that does go under caring for the earth, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Although it might go under section 4, environmental restoration and regeneration.
It could be, but I would just recommend that it be more highlighted because it's such an important issue.
Yeah, okay. I will check the full document and make sure it's not in there already. I may have overlooked it somehow. Section 3, population and consumption. Support governmental policies that address the impacts of population growth and the consequences of inequitable resource consumption and distribution. Greater empowerment of women and girls. And that, by the way, the greater empowerment of women and girls is one of the primary ways we can reduce climate change. Examine our habits and values and act to ensure right sharing of resources by all. Section 4, environmental restoration and regeneration. Restore and regenerate the environment, as well as refraining from impoverishing the earth. The consequences of pollution, waste disposal, resource depletion, and the disruptive effects of climate change should not fall disproportionately on the poor, people of color, and other marginalized peoples. Climate change has created uninhabitable conditions for millions of refugees. The U.S. should provide resources and support for climate refugees. And that is one of the primary reasons that people from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are immigrating to this country, is that climate change has made it impossible for them to grow crops to sustain themselves. The Earth's resources, use, and protection require mutual respect and cooperation. We have faith that we can continue to build this. And finally, we seek an Earth restored. So if you're like me, this kind of makes your head swim, all this stuff. It's a great deal of things, and probably covers just about every conversation I ever had about how best to implement Quaker values in the world. But there's always room for improvement. No system is ever complete or consistent.
One thought, especially in light of climate change, I don't think FCNL should take a clear policy on nuclear fission power generation.
Okay.
What is the policy stated in the
It opposed nuclear fission.
opposes the
No,
development
no
of
new development, no new generation.
Moratorium.
no new generators?
Yeah, do we have consensus on that? Or do we have agreement on that? Sorry.
Sounds like we have agreement that they should reconsider that.
We have agreement that we should consider it.
So I guess what I was saying is they should just take that one off entirely from the list. They should cross that one out.
The moratorium is problematic at this point.
Well, yeah, but I think there's still huge issues in terms of waste disposal, direct environmental impacts, and so
Yeah, I can't.
Well,
So Terry, I don't think people online were able to hear you.
oh,
Yeah, I can hear him.
the original position was taken in view of the difficulties in presented by the storage of nuclear waste, immediate environmental threats and damages. I'm not sure I'd be prepared to step away from that position without a thorough reevaluation. has the problem of storing plutonium forever gone away? I do appreciate that there have been changes, and there's a new sense of urgency to have nuclear power generation as a way of decreasing dependency on fossil fuel. And it may be time to revisit because some of the science has changed. But to my knowledge, some of the other issues, the main issues that caused us to take this position have not changed. So I'm not one to want to just take it out. I think it should undergo some process first.
I agree. I'm not at ease with removing that statement. But the most I would agree with is give reconsideration to expanding or renewing fission as an energy source.
Another way to say it might be thoroughly assess the full implications and consequences of nuclear fission as a source of energy.
But that's not a goal.
Well,
That's not what we should be doing. It's not a policy goal, right? Isn't it? I mean, we're stating a series of things that we're for and against, and right. Are we saying that others should undertake some reevaluation or something like that? We haven't really thought that through. We're saying the question is whether we're sticking to a position that we've taken in the past or not. And if we think we should undertake a reevaluation of the position, we should do that. It doesn't really have a place in a policy statement.
that is correct, Terry. We are sending to FCNL recommendations for policies or our priorities for lobbying Congress.
I think it wouldn't hurt to say that to FCNL, that we hope that that we'll take a second close look at this element of FCNL's positions. But I don't think we're recommending that FCNL step away from the position at present.
Perhaps we recommend that in their policy statement, they emphasize the difficulties of nuclear waste disposal.
Yeah, I'm not for changing the policy statement at all, actually. We can get really stuck on this. I don't see compelling reason to change the policy statement.
Yeah, I'm not sensing consensus either.
Just curious, so if there is a lack of consensus, that's sort of an automatic victory for the status quo?
Are we saying that?
That's a good general question, right?
Yeah.
They did say lack of unity on the issue of abortion, and it may be that in this particular area, there might not be full unity on whether to continue moratorium or to explore other options. So
Well, apparently at one point there was unity, otherwise it wouldn't be a policy.
Sure. Perhaps instead of just agreeing to disagree, I think Terry and others are expressing a real and serious concern with the long-term consequences of nuclear waste, as well as other environmental consequences. Wastewater is also an issue. Instead of just making a blanket moratorium, to say that Friends Committee on National Legislation seeks that all safe and environmentally sustainable solutions to any waste or consequences of nuclear power. Something that answers that concern, but that isn't just a blanket statement of opposition to all nuclear power, regardless of what new technologies might be possible.
Okay, would you mind stating that again, please?
Sorry, spontaneous composition. Let's see. FCNL calls for all that all nuclear power be generated in a way that is safe and environmentally sustainable and does not create dire problems for the future, I guess, or nuclear, like, let's see, I'm trying to figure out the best way to express this. The problem is this sort of endless radioactive waste that is going to be around for the ever. So that is, yeah.
Just a general statement on these processes. We're about consensus building, not about wordsmithing,
Yes,
right? We're not being asked to generate new text. We're being asked to express our concerns. I hear a concern is that we're no longer completely, at least some of us are no longer completely confident in the idea that fcnl should take a blanket position against the generation of nuclear power plants. I'm not sure we have among our group here a consensus on that, but we have some concerns expressed by some, and I think that's sufficient to say.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Good luck.
It's all recorded. You can check it later.
I suppose. Yeah, I guess I won't write anything down right now because it's unclear to me as what we're trying to say.
Larry, if I may, I have a more macro issue. If I infer by the presentation and order of all these priorities some ranking, it seems to me that they need to be changed, that the number one needs to be saving the earth, and number two could be the war-related things, and 3 and 4. Because right now, the United Nations and other experts have been, really putting out a sense of urgency. And we know that as long as we have a market-driven economy, until much more money can be made on non-fossil fuel things, the resistance to change will continue to be insurmountable. So I think our number one priority needs to be dealing with saving the earth, restoring the earth.
Okay, I didn't make clear that at the beginning that all of these priorities are equal. It isn't that fcnl husbands their resources, lobbying resources, for one priority as opposed to another. They emphasize all of them, and you might say, well, how is that possible?
Yeah, that's what I'd say.
The reason it's possible is that they have 20 lobbyists. So if during the year each lobbyist spends 2 months on one of these bullets, then all of the bullets have been covered.
I would also say that the long-standing statement of the values of fcnl are in the order that they're presented here, and it's not a prioritization. It certainly at various times, one or the other may become more essential to address, but I would not change the order. I think the flow and the established order of those major values are worth retaining.
I think the sense of the word priorities is this is the set of issues that we prioritize working on over those that we have not mentioned.
That's right. Yeah.
Not among the set that we choose.
Everything not mentioned here is not a priority.
I have a question that relates to the last section of the very first section, and I wonder if you could scroll back up to that.
We'll attempt to do so. Something's going wrong here.
So yeah, part 1, the very last section.
There we go. Is that the section you wanted?
Yes, thank you. And this is I think this is more than just a rhetorical point, but under number 3, women should be fully included and represented at all levels of government should be a separate item from slavery and the exploitation of child labor.
That's a good point.
It's not, they're not the same. And women should be fully included and represented at all levels of government needs to be at the same kind of category as the others. And so I would just suggest that there be 5 items under section 4 here, with women should be fully included as the new number 4 and support programs that address as the new number 5.
That certainly appeals to me, but you know, there are other priorities that kind of tuck women and girls in as an afterthought almost. Should those also be separate?
Just sort of off the top of my head without looking at them, but yeah, I mean, this needs to be more emphasized than in the current form.
Hello, this is Paul. Are you
Yeah.
ready to hear another point?
Well, I'm writing this
Oh, I'll
down.
wait a while. I'll wait.
Yeah, give me a moment, please. Okay, go ahead, Paul.
Well, this probably sounds really trivial, but I noticed it right away. And people who are fussy about punctuation notice these things. But there's a discrepancy in the use of the Oxford comma here, say 0.1 compared to. And I
Okay,
think
Paul,
I noticed that on a previous page too. I would just tidy that up.
okay, Paul, this is not FCNL that did that. That's Larry that did that. And
Okay,
Larry,
well, whoever did it, it needs
Larry
to-
eschews
in my opinion.
Larry eschews the Oxford comma.
Fine.
Yeah. That consensus. Can we see consensus on the Oxford comment?
I also don't use semicolons very well.
Yeah, no
Semicolons are one of those ingenious inventions of humankind that very few humans know how to use.
Yeah, the danger sign is when you see a semicolon and no colon.
Well, friends, perhaps it's time to go into a moment of silence before we disperse for worship.
Thank you, Larry. I just, one quick question. You've been taking notes on what the recommendations we'll make are. If you wouldn't mind just maybe reading through what the recommendations we've come
Oh,
to.
okay. All right.
Session.
Let's see. Support processes in our country to enable communications across divides. Divert more than 1% of government subsidies for food production to fruits and vegetables. Support policies and methods that would minimize carbon production. And then there's something about nuclear fission. And finally, the references to women and girls should be separate priorities.
Many girls. I thought he said William Burroughs.
There was one place where girls were also mentioned.
Mhm.
Although I think in general it was women.
I would just add as we wrap up that the Austin FCNL advocacy team is an ongoing group, and we're pursuing the ending of U.S. support for the war in Yemen, the Saudi war with Yemen. And we would welcome anyone who wants to learn about advocating and participating in FCNL work, literally in the offices of our representatives and congresspeople.
And I would like to add that by lobbying the staff members of our representatives, it's dispelled my stereotype that they're all monsters. They are human beings, very much like ourselves, and have many common values to ourselves, with ourselves.